Mission Possible, where we explore the frontiers beyond individual scale. I'm Ann Braithwaite, a systems navigator, and I'm fascinated by the potential hiding within our systems. Unleashing that potential is the secret, I believe, to tackling our biggest challenges that are too vast for any solo hero to take on alone. Each week, I'm speaking with visionaries who've discovered that our greatest resource doesn't lie in individual brilliance, rather, it's the incredible capacity that exists between us all. Join us as we discover how to tap that potential by working beyond boundaries, beyond individual scale. This season, we're focused on the natural hazard sector, and living in New Zealand, it's a sector dear to my heart. After all, this is one of the most hazard-prone countries on the planet.
In today's episode, I'm speaking with Iain White, Environmental Planning Professor at Waikato University. And I really love talking to Iain, particularly about the importance of using science in decision-making in the hazard management space, and also his thoughts on how AI and emerging tech can help us. So without further ado, here's my chat with Iain. Well, I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast Iain White. Iain, you're our inaugural guest here on Mission Possible, and I couldn't be more delighted to be speaking with you today. Mission Possible is all about how we harness our collective intelligence on some of our most intractable problems. And you, as Professor of Environmental Planning and also Assistant Vice-Chancellor Impact at Waikato, you've been researching issues connected with planning and hazards for almost 25 years now, mostly in large interdisciplinary teams.
It feels like it sometimes.
Doesn't it though? You sort of go, where did that go? And I understand from our pre-chat, you have spent a lot of time focused on making, better decisions about how we build and grow so we avoid passing on risks to future generations and liabilities. And this is at the interface between science, policy and society. So what better place to start of harnessing all of that intelligence onto intractable problems. So Iain, welcome.
Thank you. I really appreciate the invite. Looking forward to quite a good conversation around hazards, because normally a lot of the time we just get asked for sound bites from media, and the idea of quite a long format interview is really, it's great. We can get into the nuance and the detail and all those kind of things.
That's great. We're here to think about making what seems impossible possible. And I know in that 25 years or so, you've had lots of chances to both see the frustrations of that and also some of the breakthroughs that are really possible. And we'll come to the breakthroughs a little later down the track, because I know you've been giving that some thought. Perhaps though, if we start with, what are the practices or beliefs you think dominate thinking in your field right now? And let's see where we go from there.
Well, it's a really good question. It's a big question too. I think the first one I'd say is techno-rationalism, which is just a fancy way of talking about the kind of disciplines that have been involved in hazards and science and the way they tend to think. And it's a way of seeing the problem and by extension, the solution. So the term basically means we expect there's a lot of rationalism and a lot of sort of solutions that we can apply to things, and there's almost a deficit model that more information or more science equals better decisions equals better outcomes, and so the problem's just one of this kind of deficit and just improving the rationality. But I think in my field in particular, planning, it's not actually that rational, or the challenge of rationality is it's really difficult to quantify, because hazards are not the only problem. In fact, they're not even the large problem. It's not even our only crisis. And if you ask planners what their main pressures and problems are, it will probably be around housing, transport, and you're trying to create the space for climate change and hazards to have a voice in that quite congested arena. So it's much more political than rational, or the rationality extends beyond what we normally consider within the hazard space. So there's this kind of boundaries that science operates in, which is quite difficult to translate to a different field. And And that leads on to a second one, which is actually quite related. It's science deals a lot with uncertainties. And by extension, I mean, its entire thing is finding out a gap of something which is unknown. And then you're trying to fill that gap. And every science sort of project ends with, oh, we need to do this as well. We've created these new knowledge gaps. And that's sort of how science works. But urban planning and development is actually quite different. A lot of it's around certainty. They want fixed rules. They want to know exactly the investment landscape they're putting their money into. They want to know how to price risk, or how many houses can I get off this land, and how certain am I that this is going to proceed. So my field in particular is all about certainty and trying to provide certainty, and more certainty is better. And then you end up almost this rapid tick box kind of landscape where things can happen quickly and investors have confidence. But when you're dealing with probabilities, scenarios, uncertainties, futures, it's just a different way of approaching the problem that actually struggles to have a voice. I think the future is a really good way to think about it. So anytime we do climate change or climate change adaptation, which is sort of related to hazards, is you're thinking around, well, what time frame am I looking at? What kind of climate scenario are we going to deal with? And then you project forward what kind of impacts that might be and how that might look. But from a 2050 perspective, 2025 is not as interested in 2050 as we'd hope. It's interested in 26, 27, and we've got short-term election cycles, and land use and development is very political, and there's a lot of pressure on growth, and so hazard struggles to fit into the framework, and the rationalities of decision-making is you'd hope it might be. And another one which I just flagged, which is related, and it's part of this scene setting, is the economic stakes are so high in land use and development, and the political pressures are so high in enabling that the forces of hazard risk management are generally around preventing that happening. And so you have this, you're coming up against large economic stakes, teams of lawyers trying to get planning permission through for places which might not be the best place to build. But, if you can change a land use zoning from agricultural land to housing, you're a multimillionaire at the stroke of a pen. I mean, literally. And so why wouldn't you want that to happen? And understanding that this is a really difficult political and congested arena that we're sometimes naive, pulling this science into, that we expect it's going to have this outsized impact, and it struggles against the same problems we always kind of get. And so that's probably enough. I could go on with a few more, but that's just to get us warmed up.
Oh, Ian, thank you for that. What I'm extracting from that particularly is the paradoxical nature of all of that work. So the uncertainty versus certainty tension, and
yeah, definitely. Yeah.
That seems to be a core paradox that people are managing within this across a very ever-shifting landscape with both high political stakes and high commercial stakes that are playing out. Now, if we're being pessimistic, we can go, well, come on, guys, this is reality. Nothing's going to change anytime soon. So you've been in this game for some time, and I'd be really intrigued to see and hear from you about any shifts that you've seen or practices and approaches that have evolved over the past decade or more that have helped us to start to manage, if not, we can never really solve a paradox, but to live within the paradox and balance the competing needs and effects. What, if anything, have you seen shifting, and what gives you hope for some of these tensions that aren't going to go away?
Yeah, I think you're right. These tensions aren't going away. That they're a feature of the system. That this is how it works, and so part of it is just accepting that within our research, which I think is one of the good things. Is that if I had to think about one of the plus points, it's the rise of interdisciplinary collaboration in research, and we're moving away from hazard management as seen as a problem of science or engineering or particular professions. And we're thinking differently about the range of disciplines and teams and expertise that need to be involved to solve the problem. I mean, I think part of it is about the nature of societal problems. If we're thinking big picture, is that many disciplines are hundreds of even thousands of years old, and they've all been focused on finding knowledge and by extension improving society and solving problems. And the fact that some problems persist despite hundreds of years of attention is partly due to the nature, is that they cut across intellectual boundaries, they cut across disciplinary boundaries. And so I think the nature of many of the modern problems are that they're complex and they're wicked and they're more ingrained in societal aspects. And if you accept that as a problem framing, you need to fund science differently in order to make traction against those problems. And I think that's one of the encouraging signs, is that I think we're seeing a rise in interdisciplinary work and particularly hoping that's becoming normalized over time. And that's partly about our funding models, and that there'll always be a space for independent researchers to do their thing. If we have mission-led or problem-led science focused on particular intractable societal problems, then that needs a mix. It needs a team. It needs different sort of cognitive frames. It needs different ways of collecting data and putting those together in ways which might be able to sort of close that gap between science, policy, practice, and outcomes, which is what we're all interested in doing, really. So I think that's been one of the really good aspects, is it feels like that argument's been won, I think, even though the funding model hasn't necessarily kept up pace with it. Is that a lot of scientists and engineers and modelers just accept the need that there's a lot of value in bringing big teams of people together and trying to use that broad range of talent and expertise and ways of seeing the problem might have a better chance of making traction. And so that's one of the really good things that we've done. And I'd hope to see a bit more of in the future. And I think the other part is, I think there's been a shift away from seeing hazard to risk management or climate change adaptation, all those kind of fields which are related, as being a science problem, to being more of a political one. I mean, there's a story this week around a major housing project in the country that's being recommended to be built in a high-risk area. I mean, science has done its job. It said it's a high-risk area, and yet we still might see risk escalating if that decision goes ahead. And that's a really good example of the problem doesn't start and end in knowledge generation. It's about making knowledge useful, usable, and used, and making sure that science has authority in decision-making, which means we need social science as well to understand power, politics, and processes and institutional inertia, and all those kind of interesting aspects that actually show why change is resisted in many organizations and why problems persist.
So Ian, could I pick up on a couple of points and all of that, of which there were many that we could delve into, but useful, usable, used, to those who are familiar with the natural hazard sector will be familiar territory. My experience is very limited compared to yours, but in my experience, getting knowledge that is useful and usable is the smaller part of the battle. If we were to put percentages across it, it's getting it used. And you talked there, I think, I don't have your exact words, but the agency of science in decision-making. I wonder if yet science has enough sway in decision-making. So if we go back to where you started the conversation saying it's not about more generation of more knowledge, we keep wanting more knowledge, but I see us producing more and more knowledge, almost drowning in information these days. But are we making better decisions? So the used part of that story is fascinating to me. And the irony of social scientists trying to influence what are really social science issues is not lost either. So I'm wondering if you're saying examples where we have crossed that boundary from making it usable, we know as a whole piece as well. But let's assume we've got useful and usable sorted. What helps us get across the gap to used? There seems to be a real lag sometimes and a number of barriers that prevent that from happening. I'm really interested in hearing about cases we've seen it done well that we could learn from.
Yeah, I think there's two things that flag up immediately. One's on the research design and the one's on things like pathways to impact and investment signals when you're in a funding project together. It has add-ins around what expectations might be around usability and used. And I think some of our funding, I don't think that comes through strong enough. And what if it's in the bid document, there's an accountability device there. And there's a plan for action about how that's going to be implemented, by whom, when, and so on. And with milestones, which could be reported on. And so part of the issue is bringing that more explicitly out within our national funding system. And I think there's designing research with, not just with users in mind. I think we've come quite a long way, and, maybe in the past, a lot of dissemination happens at the end of a project. Oh, I found something out, let's tell people. And either the world's moved on or people were not as interested as you hoped, or they're busy. You look at the last 2 years of local government pressures on their reform agenda, they've not had the bandwidth to sort of engage with some of this science that's being produced. They're just heads above water. And so there's something around the design of research which is more partnership with users, which I think makes things more likely to be designed in a way that they're used. So there's definitely things around that. And the other side of the coin is sometimes science has an assumption about what's more useful. Is something that's, along the lines of better data. So I remember 20 years ago, I was in a meeting and there was a flood model, and it was incredible granularity already, even back then. I think they were talking about getting the flood model, way below like a meter resolution to measure the heights of, the gullies at the side of the streets, so you could work out if there was a blockage where it would go. Yeah, even better data, even more granular data gives us slightly better information, but it still needs to have power and weight within the decision-making process. And I suppose one of the worry is that scientists fit into a decision-making system that is itself under pressure and change. So if I could pick two words that actually exemplify, and not just New Zealand, but probably global public policy. So we're looking for faster decisions and more certain. It's that idea of fast track infrastructure, and the idea that processes need to be made speedier and more consistent and more almost tick box in a way. And that's been a trend in New Zealand, but it's also been a global trend in public policy. And getting our decision-making tools, which are complex and uncertain, to be reduced down to that kind of framework, I think it's just in fundamental tension with the kind of research areas that we're looking at, which are emergent, which are dynamic, and which can cascade between sort of domains. So I think the answer to the question is, I think there's many ways in which it can be done, but I think the ways which are most probable in having a greater impact are by designing research differently to involve the users in the, so they understand the decision-making tool that's being designed, or decision support tool, rather, that's being designed, and that they actually want it. There's barely a research project that gets funded that doesn't have some kind of decision support tool or toolkit or model or something like that. How many of them are used 5 years later or 3 years later, or even at the end of the project? And that kind of implementation, exploitation aspect, I think, is something that we could make more explicit in our programs to allow that to have a better chance of succeeding. I mean, there's no guarantees, because there's multiple pressures on public policy and decision making, and you get new government in, and they might have different priorities, and so that's something that we have to expect that we can't be expected to influence even in a perfect world, so we need to make it more likely in our research design.
So Ian, Have you seen examples of this working well in the last, say, 5 years? Because we're looking at what are the shifts that you've seen. You're talking about what you'd like to see. Have you seen examples of this that we could look to and go, there's the seeds of something working well?
There's a lot of research doing a lot of really good activities and working with communities to try and generate real world impact. And that's happening all over. Sometimes we don't necessarily see it, but it's definitely happening and it's definitely a trend. And there's a lot of quiet successes. Sometimes we talk about loud failures or, catastrophic events or something we'd like more of. But there's a lot of people just working hard, doing small, good things and working with communities to try and make a difference in a way. And I think that sort of lends you to then think about something around scalability. So if you are working in place-based initiatives, with groups affected and users affected, then that can make a really good difference in a place. But you're looking at then turning the specific into something generalizable and that idea of transferability and upscaling it to have a greater impact. So there's definitely some really good science out there. I think that the science challenge is the way they try to shift how research is done is probably going to pay dividends over quite a long time, even though you might look at the outcomes. It's the way that we do research that it is changing and normalizing things. And I think there are a lot of really good examples. I don't necessarily want to pick out or name any particular ones but there's definitely a lot of really good researchers doing really good work out there. And I think it's more likely to have an impact and cut through when you link with the users, whether that's the public or community or local authority or even sort of national agencies, and link to understand their knowledge gaps, understand their KPIs, their political pressures, what they're trying to do. And research isn't a consultancy. We shouldn't necessarily just fill those gaps. But if we want to have impact, we need to be aware of the kind of environment that it's going to be slotted into.
So in this pokes for me another paradox that we've got, which is that researcher-led, science-led research and investigation where very clever, very deeply knowledgeable people follow a train of thought and discover something nobody had thought about and hadn't even thunk to thought about. If I may, Dr. Zeus it. And equally, I'm thinking of slow slips here in New Zealand. I remember going back probably about mumble years where I was speaking to someone in the sector about someone had been researching slow slips, and it was just a scientific curiosity, and how much that's become something here in New Zealand and something we're deeply interested in now and is impacting us. So there's all of that research to do. And on the other side of it, the mission-led research. So in terms of that jumps out from me from what you've been talking. And equally, I can't help but note all of the, my mind's making a jigsaw of people. So not just interdisciplinary within science in itself, but within and across non-scientific industries and sectors. So I'm hearing you talk about let's have any group of end users in the room, but also it might not be so much a user, but someone who's impacted by what a user does. So your community, your politicians, so academia with industry sectors, with community sectors and political sectors and different political persuasions too, I imagine, to get the diversity of thought. So I'm starting to hear very much the move where we get the collective groups working together, we get better results, and we're going to get towards I call it making progress on, because intractable problems are intractable. And as you know, for thousands of years, many of them haven't gone away. I'm sure there were urban planning issues when the pyramids were being built, I'm sure. And they just didn't call it that back then, right? So there's all of these political will issues that are there. So I think you've painted a really good picture of what we're leaning into, and I'm very excited to hear how there's a growth. There's a way to go yet, but in the design of research, we've got pockets coming through. We're starting to see at a national level a shift in how we think about science funding and potentially science design. And by incorporating that more collective group, we will, but I didn't have greater impact. As we move into the age of AI and other emerging technologies, I'm wondering what might excite you most about that potential in this sector, and what are you seeing? Possibly you're already seeing things the rest of us are not yet exposed to. So I'd love to hear anything about that that's coming up for you.
I'll talk a little bit about what's on the horizon and what's exciting out there. But I think part of it is we still need some fundamental knowledge and those fundamental national layers of data that allow you to understand the national direction of risk. I think in a lot of areas we still don't have those. So it's good to look at the horizon, but there's some basic fundamental building blocks of national risk management. Whether it's about flood risk or hazards or landslips or whatever that we need to establish to enable progress to be monitored over time. There's some really interesting work, particularly around AI. And it's a really good example of how you assume more knowledge sort of fills in the uncertainty that you had and things get more certain with things you find out. But actually, more knowledge generates more uncertainty at exactly the same time as it generates certainty, because it's like, oh, didn't know about that. Going to find out about that now. And it's the example you just referred to. But I mean, AI is a really good example. I mean, even a few years ago, it feels like ChatGPT has been around quite a long time, but it's really, really recent. And the speed at which development is really taking place. And I think it's incredibly exciting from a research perspective. But it's also got risks as well, which I'm not sure the safeguards are keeping in pace. I think some of the fundamental principles of AI, which is just the way of using technology to inform decision making. It's just something we've had since the 60s. We've used models to inform decision making. Okay, this is now a large language model, but we've had transport models with that. Other models are around there. Part of it, I mean, it leads to a few fundamental issues where, yes, it increases your processing power and increases your speed at which you can generate and synthesize. So AI is really good at synthesis. And try and provide a good sense of a mainstream view of a corpus of knowledge of what it might say. But you've got to look at outlier events as well, which are particularly prevalent in the hazard space, things which we don't predict. The Auckland anniversary floods were Jaws. And so there's understanding the limits of using the language that it's trained on in order to understand what the future might hold is constrained by what we've told it previously and our previous knowledge and so on. So I think there's a long history of reliance on models and giving weight and authority to technology, which has not worked out well for us. I think that would be one of the things that I'm interested in seeing tempered is the ethical use of AI in decision making in a way where we don't ensure it doesn't revert to this mean or mainstream and leave vulnerable parts of our society exposed. A really good example in Urban Planet is transport models. And transport models, they're designed to make traffic flow efficiently. And they monitor traffic flow and they want a network to function efficiently. And so the logical extension of that aim, how it's programmed, is wider roads and more roads, because that allows a network to function ever more efficiently. But it's not good for places. It's not good for economic development in a lot of areas. It's not good for a whole lot of things which are outside the boundaries of the model, from safety to air quality to climate adaptation, whatever. So when we get to AI, there's a big focus on putting guardrails around it to make sure that we understand why we give it that power we do and in what decision-making format. And at what point do we allow that balance between human judgment and political judgment to allow that human-centered aspect to come back out from these sort of anomalous models. And so that'd be one thing that I think is really interesting. But yeah, I think AI, it holds a lot of, we've just done, College does some really interesting research looking at consultation responses and using AI to analyze them and compare it against human analysis. And there's a pretty decent match between them, but it's a lot quicker and you can do more fun things with it because you've got it in a format which is that data can manipulate. So it allows, on one hand, it could allow you to do more consultation quicker, because it might allow you to deal with that volume of information in a more timely factor and think about that. But it also, the problem is you don't know what's under the hood, and you don't know the biases or what's included in its decision making. And this is the issue for any model, is that you need to understand its rigor in order to assign weight to what it says, and to make sure that it's including the kind of ethical aspects that are important and the principles for decision making. And that leads you to questions about openness and closeness and proprietary software, the ability to which scientists can open that up and make sure that it's actually providing the right kind of decisions for what New Zealand needs right now.
So Ian, just picking this up, AI generating more knowledge faster or more information faster, depending on which way you want to look at it, doesn't actually solve the fundamental problem that we started this chat with, which is more knowledge, more evidence, more data doesn't necessarily lead to better decision making. Notwithstanding all your model concerns, I think it was George Cox who famously said something like all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? So it's the combination of these models that we put together. So that, again, that tension between the information, we could see us generating more and more and taking, almost abdicating responsibility to a model, whether it be an existing one or an AI-generated model, or completely at the other end, all the data tells me this, but I'm going to do the other thing instead because political will, societal drivers, and so forth. So to some extent, I imagine that it kind of will help but won't help, potentially, if we're speaking to AI, all your things. So I'm wondering if you've been seeing anything that, just in your what-if thinking brain might be coming from other fields. There's been huge advances, for example, in neuroscience, behavioral economics have angles on things, or anything that you might be seeing in your wider reading or exposure from other fields that we think, we need to, or would be useful to pick up and bring through back to the interdisciplinary aspect of solving intractable problems. Where might we look where we wouldn't naturally look to help us with this? Because it's such a complex emergent system that we're looking with. So, what have you been seeing or hearing?
I think this is a great question, because sometimes I describe myself as I prefer to work on the boundaries of my discipline, and that's where you rub against the other boundaries of the other disciplines, and you get exposed to new ideas, and it can be a bit uncomfortable at times because you're not a master of other people's work. But I think that idea of synthesis and it's very comfortable in your own discipline, but trying to reach towards the edges and the boundaries of disciplines is where there's a lot of excitement stuff going on. So, AI, which we've just discussed, which is, of course, related to computer science and all those intellectual traditions. And I think there's something around behavioral economics, which you flag, which is a really interesting part. And I think it particularly goes back to one of my earlier points, which is that probably around 15 years ago now, I gave a presentation to the UK government, does some research on, very pleased with it, and it had some recommendations in it for policy at the end, and it was around flood risk management. And I still remember exactly what the civil servant person I spoke to said. He said that's all well and good, and I agree with all that, but the reality is you're talking about a regulatory solution in a deregulatory environment. And so it just really made me think, and sort of influenced my career a little bit, is that we push ourselves towards policy or regulation or legislation as being almost these sort of firm tools which enable change to happen. And I think a broad trend of the last sort of 5-10 years has been deregulatory. It's been to shift from the state imposing rules to enable the market to make more informed judgments about informational risk or those kind of things. So it means researchers got to be creative on how to make change occur, which sort of brings you back to behavioral economics, which is a really interesting field. So I teach a little bit of this in those sort of my planning papers, but it's really fascinating because, I mean, it's very seductive and attractive for decision makers because it's like you can get the outcome you want and you don't need to legislate. Imagine that. You don't annoy everyone with this kind of rules. And so because we have this sort of switch from the sort of state imposing rules to providing guidelines for how markets operate, then that leads you towards behavioral economics, which is sort of nudging behavior signals, using information in ways which can get behavior change without needing to legislate. So really good example, flood maps, which go on limbs. Now, if you put them on limbs and you make limbs compulsory, people look at that. Some people might not buy that house, which affects its attractiveness, which allows markets to make better information, or market actors to make better information on risk. And if you want to bear that risk, you can. You're not telling anyone you can or can't do that, but you're bearing the costs of those decisions, and there's the information you need to know. And so there's some interesting research around that and how you can provide more information to try and influence and shape markets, which is something that's we tend to think of markets being free markets, but there's no such thing as a free market. Every market is shaped by society's culture of rules and legislation and its behaviors and its norms. And so any re-regulation or regulation or policy is just an attempt to remake that and remeld that in temporary fashion before it gets on again. So I really like the idea of risk signals. So insurance is a really good example of another risk signal. Sure, you can live in an exposed locality, but this is the cost. We're not saying you can or can't do anything, which is like a feature of behavioral economics. But we want to know more about, we want to use tools and information in order to allow market actors to make better decisions around what they want to do and that works for them. And so it can be really good in an individualistic manner. The downside is social equity, is that some people have less ability to respond to those signals or react to them in order to try. And so you still, even with approaches like that, which can be really attractive, basically using and harnessing the power of markets and this invisible hand to try and decrease risk over time by thinking about insurance, limbs, zoning, or even signals like compensation. We've talked about buyouts in this country, and if you get flooded, we might buy out your home. An alternative signal would be, okay, any house built from 2025 onwards, the state will not buy it out. So if you want to buy that property, just know those rules and those are the risks. And you might take a little bit more attention over risk maps. If you're a developer, you're less likely to buy riskier land because it's going to be harder to sell. And you allow some of that sort of sorting and triage to go on. Allied to that is it can be attractive for governments because it's not legislation, it's not rules, and they're very market focused, but you still need the safety net, because that's the downside, is that, in this sorting system, you end up being the poor or some most vulnerable living in the most riskier areas because other people have had the chance to act on those signals or get insurance or those kind of things.
Yeah.
So that's part of the challenges. You need to always consider the flaws of some of the policies and the maladaptive behaviors that might go on.
Thank you for that. It's again highlighting the complexity of the issue and the interfaces that are never going to go away, right? So we started with that. We can't solve these problems. We just continue to manage them and make progress on them and positive steps. If you could collaborate with, or what would you want from another sector to help, if we just broadly say the natural hazards sector or the planning sector, what would your magic wand waving moment look like? One area where you think, if only that was working better, we could really make some advances. So you can put your wish into the universe
really interesting.
and see what happens with it.
Honestly, I'm going to manifest it to come through. I think one thing that I really wanted to do for a long time is, I'll just take a step back first, is that there's a big flaw in the planning system globally in how it works. It's not necessarily a flaw, but it's a feature of how it works. So you have this really good future risk, future development. So we have zoning, we have spatial plans. And then when we receive development applications and those go through a process of development management or development control, and all planning systems have those sort of future systems of a plan making, which tries to set up the rules, and the other one which receives it. But both of those are about the future. And the reality is most of our risk is already there. And so, I remember years ago trying to find out, we've got all these tools on the future. What about what's already there? How do we influence that? I'm trying to work out how much do cities change over time. And I spoke to a few colleagues sort of internationally, and I was like, that's a really good question. There's, I think the rule of thumb, people were estimating about 2%, like the land use might change per annum, depending on development pressures, inward investment, inflation, availability of finance, all those kind of things. But the bottom line is cities don't change much, is where you get to. And there's small steps you might change annually. And that's just the normal how markets work and development works within a place. So most of our risk is already there and we can't do a lot about it. So what I'd written, so that explains where I'm coming from, is what I'd really, really like to do. This is likely impossible, but I'd really like to help to redesign a city to be resilient to hazards, recognizing that the risk is already there. We've got this legacy of historical development. How do you use a combination of public and private land to change space and, say, the storage of water, the exposure to hazards? How do you deal with things like private property rights, leasehold? How do you deal with the public realm? The public realm is actually a really massive part of any city. When you look at a GIS layer of who owns what, there's actually a lot of it under our control that we could do some quite fun things with that would integrate as part of the system. And so that idea of treating a city as a live laboratory around societal resilience, working with the councils and the public and the key stakeholders to try and understand where risk might be most prevalent, where we might change things over the short, medium, long term, how we can policy or financial incentives to make land use more likely to shift from land use A to B. That would be a really cool, ginormous project, way bigger than one small research group, and you'd have to have the political will to do it. But you've seen in some cities around the world that a political will change can happen quickly. Paris, in the way that it's embraced, the 15-minute city model and the way that its transport has changed quite rapidly in a couple of years because the mayor and the key actors are all aligned across this clear vision of what it might look like. And I really like the idea of having a clear vision of a future resilient city and just aligning various actors and agencies around that, and where science is a part of the project, but it's actually much more complicated and ambitious than that.
Iain, thank you so much. I'm loving that this is coming to a conclusion on this topic because we've seen it's possible in other cities. It's possible for New Zealand to do what I call your mission possible, which is to redesign a city here or a town to be a resilient space. So perhaps our collective call to whoever's listening to us is to get on board with this and see what we can't trigger, because it is possible. We've seen it elsewhere. So Iain, any final thoughts, anything you want to highlight, leave our listeners with today, and before we wrap up?
I really enjoyed these chats, these formats where you can really get into complexity and nuance and trade-offs, because a lot of society and politics is quite short. It's sound bites, it's polarization, and people, the scientists waving their hand saying, actually, this is complex and uncertain. So it doesn't get as much attention. So I really love the opportunity to talk about some of these things in a podcast. So thanks.
Thank you, and we'll look forward to chatting with you more in the future years. Thank you. So what a wonderful chat with Iain, and his moonshot idea really got me thinking about how we can look back to the past about resilient cities. Iain said he would love to make an existing city resilient, and that was his big moonshot idea. And it turns out this is a challenge that's not restricted to our modern times. So I'd like to introduce you to our next segment, which is Old Ways, New Ways, and we're jumping there right now. As a bit of an ancient history fan, I was aware of a place called Caral in Peru. In 2015, the International Union of Architects met at Caral, which is now a UNESCO Heritage Site, and signed the Caral Letter, which hails the ancient city as an example of sustainable urban planning and living in harmony with nature. And they were doing this ahead of the UN climate talks in Paris in the same year. The letter was signed by a group of no less than 124 nations who came together to highlight how sustainable urban planning needs to be brought to the attention of modern times, and Caral is a brilliant example of that in practice. One of Peru's leading architects and advisor to the International Union said, "We turn to the past to see how civilization was organised 5,000 years ago, thinking about their commitment to nature and their cosmic vision." So what was so interesting? Well, the ducts used at Caral to supply air to fires during religious ceremonies effectively were inventing the Venturi effect, which physicists have discovered since and put a name to. But 5,000 years ago, they'd already solved this problem. We're discovering the work of architects and engineers at the time when there were no instruments like the level or the plumb line. It's high engineering, said Jose Arispe, one of the architects involved. And I couldn't agree more. How often do we invent things and solve problems and we're not even aware of all of the snazzy science that lies behind it? The other thing that I particularly love was the fact that they already invented floating foundations. Buildings in this city, and it's a seismically active area then and today, were set upon big cages of stones that effectively made a floating foundation that the housing and the building stood upon. And the technique minimised the earthquake damage. Beyond that, they were really interested in living in harmony with nature, and it was a pretty active place, obviously. They were very interested to make sure that they protected the productive land, and they considered that sacred, so none of the buildings were in fact put on those productive, fertile fields. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that today. When I think back to Iain's moonshot idea of creating a resilient city in an existing city, because let's face it, we're not all building new cities in different places. We've got to live with what we have. There's much that we can learn from those in Caral and many other civilizations aside. So thanks for joining me on these exciting Mission Possible conversations. I hope you'll join us for the next session. We've got a number of conversations lined up for you, which I think you'll find interesting and inspiring. So once again, I'm Ann Braithwaite. This is Mission Possible. We'll see you next time.